greatest magic trick ever created.
Awesome. How many guys have seen it? How many of you have seen it so far? Have you seen it?
Oh,
Just a couple.
only two.
Great movie. You're going to enjoy it. It's nonstop action. We're glad you're here for our Summer Blockbusters series. Now, the whole point of this whole series is to catch the spiritual themes in the summer's hottest movies, because we have this bad habit of convincing ourselves that God can only be seen at certain places, like at church, in certain times, like Sundays or Wednesday nights, you know what I mean? And so we need to learn to see God in everything. And actually, it's one of the teachings of Jesus that we would get the eyes to see and the ears to hear, and that's especially true of the movies.
Now, we love movies. We go to the movies every year. We like to do a message series in the middle of the summer every year to kind of celebrate what's happening in the theaters. And this year, when we saw Now You See Me 2, we were a little excited. How many of you saw Now You See Me 1? Oh, there we go. Okay. So we were excited because we wanted to go back and see all the characters. And so we go. If you haven't seen the movie, basically the movie is about a group of magicians, and they do magic and things. But they use their powers for good, not for evil. So usually when they're out doing their magic, they do it to overcome something. Something's going to happen to people, and they use their magic to stop that. But as we were watching this movie this year, I was, all these interesting characters and all these people, just kind of felt like something was missing in the midst of it. Like there's something just missing. And Michael and I got to the car, and he's like, well, what'd you think? Because it had action, and it had adventure, and it had magic. What more could I want? And I told him I was so disappointed. He's like, what? What are you disappointed? I said, I'm disappointed because I don't know any of these people's stories. And isn't it interesting that when we know people's stories, everything changes?
And so we got to talking about this concept of story. Because story, when you think about it, our story is really what makes us human. It differentiates us from all the rest of the animals in the world because we create a story. We remember a story. We tell stories about each other. And our story is where we draw our identity from. It's all our past, our present, the things that are going to happen in the future. It's those crushing defeats you had and the amazing wins that you had. It's the losses you suffered. It's the things that you got that you never saw come, and the blessings. It's all those things come together to form an identity for who we are as human beings. And so story is such an integral part of who we are. And when it comes to our faith, don't miss this. When it comes to our faith, your story is probably one of the most important things you have, because that's how we share our faith. Don't miss that part. Our story is important to our faith because that's how we share our faith. It's got so little to do with Scripture or your theology or your doctrine. It has almost everything to do with your story. And even the Bible, when you look at the Bible, it's a story. If you look at the overarching narrative, it's a story of God's love for humanity and for this world. And it starts off very small, and it expands, and it expands, and it expands, and it's still expanding today. His love is still expanding for humanity today. And that's the story. God's love story. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, that should be a clue to us that our story should look something like that. And one of Jesus' followers, his name is Peter, he actually is one of the first ones called out. And Peter had an amazing story himself, right? I mean, if any of you, and I think Peter Dolan talked about him like last week, didn't he? He talked about Peter. He was started off just a simple little fisherman, and he became the leader of the church. But along the way, just crazy things happened to him. Miracles were performed, and he even denied Jesus, and Jesus called him back into leadership and allowed him to lead the church forward. And this is what Peter had to say. He said, if you don't remember anything, remember this. You must worship Christ as Lord of your life. Make Jesus your Lord. Give everything to Jesus. Try your best to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear what God is leading you forward in Jesus. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Have your story ready. Here's the thing. We never are intentional about making our story ready. We have little God stories that we have and that we'll share from hearing. But what about the overarching narrative of our life? How God interacted with us all around. And what he's really saying, he's saying, get your story right, because this is how you're going to share your faith. And you're not going to have much of a story if you don't give your life to Jesus first. And so that's what we're talking about today, is how to have that story. Because when it comes right down to it, that's what people want to hear. They don't care how much Scripture you know. They want to know how real God is to you and what God does for your life. How has God changed you? How has God transformed you? When it comes down to it, it's all about the story.
And so how can we always be ready? Well, if we're always going to be ready, we've got to spend some time examining our lives and examining our story. And, you know, we were thinking, what does story do for us? There are some things that story, this concept of story, does to us in our lives. First of all, it builds trust. You know, there's just something that happens. Have you ever been sitting with somebody and they decide to be vulnerable with you? And they decide to be open with you? Or you share something with somebody and they can hold it? Another thing that it does is it forms connections. And when it forms connections, it allows us to be present. Have you ever tried to share your story with somebody and they're not even listening? You know? But when they do listen, it just forms this connection. It helps us to be present for one another. Another thing that it does is that it opens our heart. I mean, we are people, you know, we make up stories about people all the time. And then when we hear their story, it opens our hearts and it opens our eyes. And maybe they share something as part of their story to where we can relate to them in such a way that we utter the most powerful phrase on the planet, me too, me too. Another thing is we can learn from others in the midst of our stories. See, we live in a world where people want to fact check each other all the time and everybody wants to be the expert. But guess who the expert of your story is? You are the expert. No one can take that away from you. Another thing that story does for us is story, you know, it knocks down barriers between us. And we don't have the barrier anymore. We can drop our judgment. When we know somebody else's story, it helps us to remove barriers. And then finally, I believe that the power of story transforms lives. You know, it kind of reframes things. You know, we've all been in places where we've seen something, we've been around somebody, and when we run into them, we make a snap judgment of them, and then somehow somebody says, oh, did you hear about her? This happened to her, this happened to her, and sometimes we're ashamed, aren't we? We're ashamed of those judgments. So story changes everything. I can't help but think when it comes to the shooting that we just experienced, you know, the things that the different shootings that we just went through this last week, how story could have maybe perhaps got us a different outcome. You know, when someone gets pulled over and you know the story and someone's a father or some of these police officers who were standing out there, somebody would have known that one young man had moved all the way from Atlanta because his dream, the dream of his life was to be a policeman. Maybe that would change something if we knew each other's stories when we see people and we want to judge each other. Maybe story could change everything. Maybe story is everything. And so this morning, in order to equip us to better deal with this world that we live in, this world filled with violence and hatred and where no one seems to be listening to anybody, maybe we need to focus on the power of story. And so when you came in, you were given a little sheet. It's got a thing for you to kind of work through your story. This is something you don't have to do now, but you can take it home with you. And we're going to look at the life of the Apostle Paul. And we're going to examine his life before he knew Christ, that's the moment that he met Christ, the moment Christ became real, and then after what happened to him. And that's how we'll go through this exercise together, examining our lives, our story, through the lens of God at work in us. Because at the end of the day, story is everything.
You know, when we talk about Paul, now to us, we're kind of our calling, part of our calling, and some of you know this, some of you don't, that we are church planters. This is the second plant, and the church is calling us ahead to go ahead and plant the third one out near the Zert Road area. And so Paul is the original church planter. And so for us, kind of a hero, you know? And so when Paul shares his faith, you got to watch how he does it, because he falls right into that format of telling the before story, the during story, and the after story. And it's just so powerful. You can't imagine the lives he changed, because you're sitting in church today because he did what he did, and he shared the stories. There's a church in America today because of that. Most of the churches in America today are because of that. So listen to what he says. Listen to what Paul says. And I love Paul because he is unflinchingly honest about his past. Listen to what he says. He says, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus, and I was brought up and educated here in Jerusalem. He's talking to a bunch of Jews that want him arrested because he's preaching about Jesus. He says, I was carefully trained in our Jewish laws and customs, and I became very zealous to honor God in everything I did, and I persecuted the followers of the way. Those are Christians. I persecuted these people, hounding some to death and arresting both men and women and throwing them in prison. And he is just unflinchingly honest about his past. He doesn't polish it up. He doesn't show everybody the shiny side. You know, are you like that? You know, you tell your stories about your past, you kind of kind of weed out some of the bad things, right? You don't share all the bad stuff because you don't want people to hate you, right? And so you don't, but he's just like, this is who I was. He says, I was religious. I was so religious, my religion was my God. Do you get that? He said, my life was centered about being religious. And I have my own personal little jihad going on to kill your brothers and sisters that decided to follow Jesus. He's telling them this. I don't even know if I could go home now and talk to some old friends from school and tell them I'm a pastor, because they would just laugh at me and walk out of the room, right? Because they know my past. They know what I was like. But man, that's where the power is, because when you share that with someone who doesn't know Jesus, hasn't had their life transformed, isn't moving towards what God wants for them, what happens is it gives them hope that God can use them too. Because when it comes right down to it, it's all about the story.
So then Paul goes on, and Paul's going to share with us what happens at that moment when he met Jesus. And the during part is the part where God became real to him. So let's see what Paul had to say. Paul says, as I was on the road, a very bright light from heaven suddenly shone down around me. Can you imagine? I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I asked, and the voice replied, I am Jesus. I asked, what should I do, Lord? The Lord told me, get up and go. You'll be told everything you are to do. Boy, talk about an encounter, huh? I always say, I wish God just send me an email, I'll do whatever he wants, right? But Paul gets the encounter of all encounters. And a lot of times when we see this, it can be a little intimidating to us, because some of us, we grew up in church all our lives, so we don't, a lot of times I hear people that grew up in church all their lives are like, I don't have that big moment, that big story, all that. But think about it, we all have stories about a moment when God was very, very real to us. Or maybe you do have one of those moments, and people fall all over the spectrum on those. The interesting thing about this moment in people when it comes to stories is that everyone's story is unique. And isn't it wonderful that God speaks to us or appears to us in just the way that we need? And on your handout, it has some questions about, this during time for you to think about that. How did God get your attention? Describe your encounter with God. And after you had your encounter with God, how did your opinion of God change? Do you think Paul's opinion of God changed after he had this encounter? Absolutely. Because when it comes to our faith, it's all about the story.
And then he tells his after story. And this is the kicker right here. Listen to what he says. He says, I was blinded by the intense light. He's still telling the story about Jesus. And had to be led to Damascus. And a man named Ananias lived there, and he came and stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. And at that very moment, I could see him. And then he told me, the God of our ancestors, he's prophesying to him, has chosen you to know his will. For you are to be his witness, get this, telling everyone what you have seen and heard. So you're being called out to become a Christian, to follow Christ, to worship Christ and Christ alone. You're being called, and you're being called out to tell everyone what God does with you in that. He's being called to do exactly what we're talking about, being called to share his story. And then the guy looks at him and goes, what are you waiting for? Do it now. And maybe that's for us. What are we waiting for? Maybe it's just we're not ready. Maybe we didn't put it together. Maybe we haven't been following Jesus like we need to so that God can write that story, right? But look at what Paul did. He created a heritage that has lasted thousands of years because he was all in with God, and he shared that story over and over and over again. He allowed God to write a story with him. What a heritage. Think about that. I come from one of those families. Are you in one of those families where, like, you can name your third uncle twice removed, and he's your whatever, and he was in the Revolutionary War or something like that, and you've got a history. I was in one of those families that had no history, right? There was nothing, no good stories anybody wanted to pass down to me, ever. I want to change that. I want my family to have a heritage of people that followed God and had amazing stories to tell. Because of it. What do you want? What do you want with your life? Do you want that heritage? Do you want that passed down to your kids and your grandkids and their kids? On this handout, look at this handout. on the back of it, it says my after story. It says, how does knowing Christ now compare to your previous life? This is the things we have to start thinking about. In what areas of your life has God changed you? And what is your biggest struggle in your faith journey? You've got to talk about the struggles along the way too, because this is a growth process. You're not completely fixed once you're saved, but this is a growth process. And it says, and when it comes to your faith, what's your biggest hope? What do you hope God does with you? And this one, this is the most powerful one, and it's an ancient question that's been asked for a few centuries. How is it with your soul right now? Can you answer those questions? Do you have an after story that God is writing right now? Because when it comes right down to it, it's all about the story.
Paul tells us to be prepared, to be ready to give an answer. And for far too long in the church, we've boiled that little bit around, and we've boiled it down to a bunch of evangelism tactics. And we got to take this class, and we got to do this, and we got to memorize this road and this scripture, and we got to do all those things. When really God has always spoken to humanity through the power of story. And Peter said this. He said, "You must worship Christ as Lord of your life. There are people who are watching you every day, how you live your life. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it." And a lot of us, the reason we're not ready to explain it is because we haven't even really taken the time, the reflection time, to think about what God has done in our midst. And we've given you these handouts today, and you know what I know about these kind of things? Most of us, when we're at the car wash in about 6 weeks and we're cleaning out the car, where will this be? It'll be in the back seat of the car, right? And we'll pick it up and we'll crumble it up and we'll put it in there. But I hope you'll take the time to really think about what is your story with God, and that you will be ready to explain it. This world is in desperate need of hearing the stories of God at work in all of us in the unique ways that he can speak to each and every one of us. But then Peter adds a line which I think is so important where our country finds itself this morning. He says, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. And wouldn't you say that in our country we've lost this sense of gentleness, haven't we? And we've lost this sense of respect. It's always about who's right, who's wrong, who's in, who's out, who's white, who's black, all these constantly, our story. But what if we could tell our stories in a gentle and respectful way? And as the man said to Paul when he had his encounter with God, what are you waiting for? I think that's a powerful question for us as Christians. What are we waiting for? What I know is this: the world is waiting on us. The world is waiting on us. Because when it comes to our faith, it's the story that's most important.
Okay, get the praise team going. Come on up. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do in this series, this Summer Blockbusters thing, is we wanted to give you a chance to share your stories. And we know each other.
The band's on the
Kinda.
stage. Supposed to be. Where's Frank?
We know each other, kind of. We know a little bit. We know some stories. We know some. But what if we really, really knew our stories? What if we knew each other's stories inside and out? What if you went home today and you took the time to fill this out? It doesn't have to be extensive. It doesn't have to be a long narrative or anything. It'd just be bullet points for that matter. What if you went home today? What if you challenged yourself to do this? And then over the next few weeks, come to a story session on a Sunday afternoon, and we'll schedule it out. But we're planning on having story sessions where we sit down, and as your pastors, you share your stories with us and with everybody in the room, and we share our stories with you, so that we understand the overarching narrative that God is creating here at Heritage Church. That God is creating a bigger story for this community. And if we know each other's stories, we'll know how it all fits together. It starts with us. And once you get comfortable sharing your story with your brothers and sisters, what's to keep you from sharing them with your friends that aren't even in church or don't follow God? Now, we know for a fact that there's some people in here that they're still on the before side of this, and that's okay. Write that down. Be honest about it. If you're not there, you're not there. That's okay. Come and share your story anyway, because your story matters. Your story matters. And there's no telling what God will do with you. But what you're going to hear the stories of faithful people that God has done amazing things with. And there's no telling what that could do for you. So look in your little announcement sheet, look at the back little piece right here. This is this info card, this thing you were supposed to fill out and put your name and email, any information you want to give. That actually rips off. So tear that off now, and look at the back of it. And there's a place for information, but there's some next steps. We want to challenge you on these next steps. This is going to be critical as we move forward as a church. It says, I will attend a story session. We'll start scheduling these out depending on how many we get and how many people and stuff, but we're going to do them on a Sunday afternoon. So I will attend a story session, and I think this is great, I will learn someone's story this week. Ask questions. We have forgotten how to ask questions. Become curious about the people around you, and you might be amazed at the stories they have to tell. And then look at the next steps. It says, I want to place my faith in Jesus. You might be at a place right now where you're still on that before, and you need to take that step and start worshiping Jesus as the Lord of your life so that God can start writing that story with you. If you'd like to mark that down, please